people to grapple with tough questions. They often offer different strategies for doing that. Different strategies for grappling with questions. All three are motivated by the same basic desire, to try and figure out the answers to these things. Some questions lend themselves to scientific treatment, some questions don't. Same with the other disciplines. I think there's no reason even to divide them and separate them out in that way. I mentioned to you already that I myself am an atheist. This is going to become important because we're going to talk about philosophy of religion in a couple of weeks. But I'm certainly not going to be presenting to you my particular beliefs, but you should know what they are. You will hear people say that there's a tremendous conflict between religion and science. You'll hear people on both sides of the conflict say that. You'll hear people who have no interest in science at all and people who have no interest in religion at all saying that from time to time. But I don't think that that's a necessary truth. As far as I know, for example, lots of people who are very religious find scientific confirmations for their religious beliefs. And there are many people at the very cutting edge of the sciences who are extremely religious. Particular religious doctrines may part from, conflict with particular scientific doctrines, but there's no need for a conflict between science and religion. And there's certainly no need for a conflict in any of these three areas. One may take as one's motivation for trying to understand the universe as closely and as precisely as one can one's own awe of nature, one's desire to figure out what God's handiwork really is. And that might be one's motive for studying science. So there's no need for these things to conflict. Where the dividing lines are is not so clear. As I said, at the cutting edge of science, and I think at even the basis of religion, are deep philosophical questions. So when I write things like this, the second point in this first introductory discussion, the second point is that I don't really know that those things can be divided in any clear-cut way. I mean, philosophical issues, this much is clear. Philosophical issues, I've said, are ones that are not quite so clear-cut as other issues. So within science, for example, there will be lots of issues that are clear-cut. What's the value of this variable? What's the equation for that? But there are other questions that are more philosophical. Like sometimes sometimes it comes to the attention of physicists that equations that they've been using for years may not be the very most accurate and best ones. So they have to go out and look for alternatives. And different people might have different ideas. For a long time, there might be arguments among scientists. I like this procedure. Oh, no, I like this procedure. And those would be philosophical differences. So within science, you'll find both questions that are clear-cut and questions that are not so clear-cut. But generally, what I'm trying to say in the second point is that these are not necessarily in conflict, philosophy, religion, science. There will be some points of difference in procedure. There will be some points of difference in the mode of training in the several areas, but there will also be, perhaps, some commonality. All of them, I think, derive from a single human motivation. That's to try to understand things. Try to understand things. In the world, try to understand things about themselves, try to understand their relationships with other people, and it's these efforts to understand that lead to these to get these fancy names. Questions, comments, anything that I've... Yes?
Sort of like, something there's a lot of reading Leibniz philosophy
about
how they feel about things.
Yeah. That's almost... I was about to say that's almost inevitable. One way of understanding the whole idea of God is just as the ultimate answer, the ultimate explanation. I think at least this much can be said, that for those who believe in God, there is something of that role that God plays. I should tell you the other story. I don't speak out of complete ignorance about this. I used to be a Baptist Youth Fellowship leader some millions of years ago. No longer am. They don't want atheists to be Baptist Youth Fellowship. But when I was in my teens anyway, there's evidence, I've forgotten how old I was, but somewhere in my teens, still, early teens probably, I wrote an essay in which it's obvious, if you read this thing, it's obvious, if I take the idea, the one I now have, the idea that there's no God, that idea to me back then was just so ludicrous, it made no sense at all. Now, interestingly, I can't quite place myself in that person anymore, but I do remember lots of things about belief, and belief in God, among other things, has this aspect. I don't know how central it is. It seems to me, in my case anyway, it had this aspect that it helped provide answers. It helped you place yourself in the world. It made sense of things. In looking at different religions in other cultures, I think you can see that very clearly, that in those other cultures, those other religions, there's lots of things where you might not attribute a divine intervention. But you can see what they're up to. Often it's where they don't understand, where something lacks a clear-cut answer. They often will say, well, that's one of the aspects of divinity. In trying to handle diverse arrays of complex and confusing facts, sometimes the idea of a God will serve to bind everything all together. But that's also what theories do, isn't it? That's what theories are supposed to do. When we have a bunch of complex facts, sometimes a scientific theory or a philosophical theory will be brought forward in a hope to bring these things together, show you how these things relate. For example, in the Newtonian move from earlier physics, we had Galileo. I mentioned Galileo as having figured out what the laws of motion were for objects like that.
I don't know.
On the surface of the Earth.
I really don't know.
Motion were for projectiles fired out of cannons, for
I just wanted to check the math out, I guess.
Tower of Pisa, for things set in motion down inclined planes. Galileo figured out accurate laws of motion that, at least within the limits that were of importance to them, were determined. For example, what the future position of an object would be if it starts out here, if it's let go with this initial velocity and it's under these forces. He was able to compute that. Johannes Kepler, on the other hand, was able to figure out what the real laws of motion were of the planets as they orbited the sun. Not moving objects on the Earth, but the planetary objects. And one of Newton's great contributions was to show that he could cast the laws of motion in such a way that both these very different areas of motion could come under the same thing. And then to just put a loop on this connection between references to God and references to science, Newtonian physics then, for the next couple hundred years, became, I mean, I don't know that anyone actually used this expression, but it came to be understood by lots of the physicists who were studying it as an examination of how God's laws worked. I mean, God had been, the author of the motions of the planets. God is the author of the forces in the universe. That's a long-standing idea. Now we're beginning to figure out what the different laws of motion are. But that doesn't undermine the idea that God's in charge. That just says, these are the laws that God set out. This is how God does it. Oh, that's cool. This is how God's clockwork works. And the whole universe was understood by Newtonians up until the beginning of the century anyway. It was understood the whole universe was a giant clockwork, and God was the designer. We'll return to that theme later on, part of our study of philosophy of religion. But all of this is mixed up together. And what I want to leave you with is just to remind you, this isn't just an historical anomaly. This isn't just an historical fact about what people used to think. To this day, I mean, if people study the origins of the universe according to contemporary theory, the best modern theories, the most well-supported modern theories, are ones that refer to a Big Bang. Indeed, a Big Bang and then a constantly expanding universe. There's all kinds of alternative theories that have kind of fallen by the wayside right now. So contemporary physicists figure there was a Big Bang, a singularity, and that's a very complex fact too. There's a Big Bang and the entire universe, all of matter energy, and in addition, this is what's really weird and complicated, all of space and time were created by that Big Bang. But that doesn't stop people from asking the question, well, why is the Big Bang? And for some, that's a religious question. So it's not, modern progress in science, even modern evolutionary theory, has not stopped people, even people who believe in modern theories, has not stopped them from continuing to ask the religious question. And so the parallel that you find in even modern writers in physics, Albert Einstein among them, God does not play dice, is one of Einstein's favorite remarks in his argument with Niels Bohr about the nature of quantum mechanics. And what that symbolized for him was that we cannot be left with a physics that's indeterminate, as quantum mechanics seems to lead physics. Now again, I don't mean to try to teach you quantum mechanics here in this course, but the arguments to this day among state-of-the-art scientists are sometimes couched at least in this religious vocabulary, and it means something to them. They're not just joking around. The universe, Einstein can best be understood as saying, the universe just wouldn't make sense if this was all that could be said about it. Or, and the universe, of course, must make sense. God doesn't throw dice. It makes sense to describe those differences as philosophical. Just as
see what time it is.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
2:33.
People's normal lives, we have to try and figure out the answers to questions that aren't easy to resolve. I think these questions about what's best for us, which you might or might not think of as questions. Trying to go, what's in my best interest? It's not a question that you can't turn over a rock someplace and find out the answer to that. Now, this may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think given the character, given the nature of the human being, we're just set up so that we can't avoid these kinds of questions that I'm talking about, philosophical questions. I mean, we're not wired in nearly the kind of automatic way that many other animal species are. We've got to gather information, consider all kinds of consequences, and make decisions about what to do rationally. That's the word that's used. We use reason. And we have to make estimates of what's the best course of action in the light of incomplete information. I've sometimes said that people need to do philosophy. We understand this particular interpretation of what philosophy is. People need to do philosophy as much as they need to breathe. Again, that's a little bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but what I mean by that is, given the kind of creature we are, we can't just rely on hard wiring, and we certainly can't rely on just what other people tell us, because they tell us different things. And we can't rely on books, because the books tell us different things. Somewhere along the line, we've got to make decisions. We've got to make decisions in light of incomplete evidence. And those are just the kinds of problems that I've been calling philosophical, especially when there are things like, well, how should I interpret the way this person is acting toward me? What's in my best interest? What's the right thing to do in this situation? All those questions qualify under my very broad definition as philosophical questions. Now, these sorts of questions arise automatically for every individual and within every society and can be found in the history of every culture. We're stressing these Western figures, the texts, these classics of Western philosophy, and that is a little bit parochial. That is, it's a little bit too limited. It would be nice if we could really examine in good comparative detail philosophies from all over the world, from all eras. But you see the thickness of this book. The thickness of that book would be...
Okay, just 30 minutes until the meeting.
A decent course in world philosophy, but I think that would necessarily have to be a bit more historically directed than I want to be. What I want to do today, though, is at least place in context for you the works that you're reading. Stuff by Plato, the Republic, I'm sorry, not reading the Republic, but you're reading the Apology and the Credo. I want to kind of place them in context. They were written at a time that's sometimes thought of as the birth of Western culture in classical Greece. The works of Plato are often thought to be some of the first works in philosophy. Plato is thought as the father of Western philosophy. A lot of this stuff has a good deal of hype to it.
10 minutes.
My guess is that people have been doing philosophy much, much longer than is documented in the book that begins with Plato. But the fact about Plato is that he's the first person for whom we have a large and extensive library. He wrote lots of things which have survived. We still have his work. People who wrote before him we know something about them, and we talk about
maybe
them today.
the map that I'm reading is
Their
wrong.
work has not survived, at least not in large chunks. We've got fragments of their work.
No,
here,
there it is.
A page there.
On the map.
We've got little bits and pieces. We have to interpret what it was that they've said. We know from some commenters, like Aristotle, who's a student of Plato's. Aristotle actually wrote a good deal about what some of these earlier people thought, and so that gives us some clues about what they're like. But Plato had at least one important part of his value in the history of Western thought, just that his work survived. And even before the Greeks, even before the stuff that we have written down, it stands to reason that people were doing philosophy, at least as you understand it in this broad way I've characterized it. People were doing philosophy as long as there have been people upon. So I don't want to make too much of the idea that this is the beginning of Western philosophy. But it's the place we could start is we know a little bit about our ignorance, pretty much obscures stuff much earlier than this. The things that were philosophical topics back then, as you can imagine, were in much larger numbers. And I shouldn't say the numbers were larger, but some things that we regard as having achieved clear-cut solution had not, at that time, had any kind of clear-cut analysis. To give you an idea, some of the earliest people we know of in Greece are people who were arguing about metaphysics. They're arguing about the basic principles of
And for the leg,
reality
Jimmy.
that we all live in. As you might know, historically speaking, this is not necessarily a significant order, but there's been a lot of historical work in an area that you might think of as physics that based itself on the idea that there are four essential elements, and that's these. How they are to be understood with respect to one another, whether they are of equal importance in the creation of the physical world. That's one of the things that the Greeks argued about. And Thales is sometimes thought to be the first of these pre-Socratic philosophers. I'll put this heading up here so you remember that. Why would they be called pre-Socratic philosophers? Yes, they're before Socrates. Among the pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales is thought to be the first. He's at least the first that we have any kind of a clear idea about. He said that the water is the most basic element. And that these weren't equally important, that the other three were less important and even perhaps derived from water. Now Thales, this wasn't just a guy who, just an idle speculator. He apparently was quite a brilliant astronomical observer. We have good reason to think that he predicted an eclipse in 5-something BC. The solar eclipse. And that indicates not just how good he might have been at astronomy, but it indicates that what we call science was in a pretty good state, at least the science, the astronomical science. We have some evidence that in cultures all over the world, astronomy was one of the earliest sciences that was developed, and that it achieved a pretty significant degree of precision, at least in being able to observe the regularities of the way that the planets moved and stars moved, and being able to make predictions. So science, some of these areas of inquiry were really quite well developed. Thales was very proficient in that discipline. He also apparently was a great military advisor. But he, in his speculations about the nature of reality, thought that water was more important than the others. And we can guess what the reasons might be. After all, the reasons in the early world where water was very important, the seas, the rivers. But the water, interestingly enough, is one of the few elements that you could expect Greeks, even though they live in a fairly warm climate, there's mountains where you can find snow. Greeks might have seen, they're likely to have seen water in all three of its material states, seen it as a solid, a liquid, a gas. That might give some reason to think of it as being more important than some other materials. But also, when you see water either evaporated or even in the morning you get up and there's a lake and it's sort of a cool day or something like that, and you see the vapors coming off the lake, it might give you the impression that air is being created in this way. Water at a delta, when it comes out of a river, I mean, if you take a sample of the water, you'll find that it's muddy, and if you let it stand for a while, dirt will precipitate out and rest at the bottom. That might give you the impression that Earth is created from water. So my guess is that this wasn't just an idle speculation. He probably thought he had some reason to think that water was more important than the other elements. But let me take another list. Thales is just the beginning of a lot of this philosophical disagreement about things that we now wouldn't think of as so philosophical. I mean, things that are in the areas of sciences, physics. Thales, again, thought that water was basic. Some of his followers argued, no, it's air, and they presented good reasons for that. Anaximander, I think different people in different towns often had different approaches to the physical sciences. Anaximander was of the view that none of these four things, not earth, not air, not fire, and not water, none of them was really the most basic. All of them emerged from something yet more primitive that he called the indeterminate. There was some sort of like a pure potential that he thought was at the origin of things, and that this pure potential then could coalesce through certain kinds of processes into earth, air, fire, and water. I mention that not just because it's of historical interest, but some of these things, especially now in the 20th century, some of these ideas about the importance of potential and probability have come back into the discussions, the philosophical discussions in interpreting physics, especially with the development of quantum mechanics. But the pure potential is kind of back on the scene again, something that at least has some physical importance. But Anaximander thought that everything mentioned originally came from the indeterminate. And there were a lot of arguments about it. And each one of these theorists, with their different theories about what the world is made of, could really make a plausible case for their theory. And among them, later on, Heraclitus, who's famous. You may have actually heard this particular line that he, in his first uttered, said, you can't step into the same river twice. He thought that the most basic thing about the world was change, not permanence. That all things, I mean, like you think about the river, I mean, what is a river? It's not just the water that makes it up. Because from day to day, there's different water flowing in that river. From month to month, there's different water flowing in that river, and it's still the same river. So what the river is can't be analyzed as simply whatever it is that makes the river up just now. We're going to return to this thing at the end of the quarter in a more interesting form. But he was thinking about people, biological entities, even rocks, cliffs, began to argue that all of these things are really impermanent. That flux, change, is the real key to understanding the world, and the only thing that might be permanent would be the rules or laws that govern change. Now that's like saying there's nothing physical in the world that's permanent. The only thing that would be permanent are sort of natural laws that guide it, laws of physics, laws of nature. And that became a very influential idea later on. But Heraclitus said nothing's permanent, everything's changed, and then just down the road in another town, Parmenides was arguing precisely the opposite. That there was nothing, that change was absolutely impossible. Why? Well, I don't want to make too much of this, but I'll see if I can sketch it quickly. Change is impossible for this reason, that in order for something to change, it has to become what it is not. But it's impossible for anything to not be. It can't become what it is not. Or else it won't be it. So for this reason, and for more subtle reasons, not a great deal more subtle, he argued that not only is change impossible, but motion is impossible. All there is the one, said Parmenides. And his student, I put him here because student Parmenides, was the author of a bunch of different paradoxes which were supposed to illustrate some of these Parmenidean themes. He argued that there's no way, for example, to the race between tortoise and hare. There's no way for the tortoise, for the hare to catch the tortoise, no matter how much faster, Achilles, I think, that he used in this example. There's no way for the faster creature to catch the slower one if the slower one spotted any kind of advantage for this reason. Let's say it's Achilles and the tortoise. Let's say this is the tortoise. Give him a head start. Achilles is a fair sort of guy. And this is where they are at T0, the very beginning of the race. Okay? So then, bang, the gun goes off and they begin their race. And so Achilles, being very, very quick, soon gets to this point here. I better call this A0 and T0 because then that becomes A1, right? That's where Achilles gets in a certain finite time. We don't know how fast unless we're told exactly how fast Achilles runs. But in that particular time, the tortoise, of course, has gone some finite distance to here. Okay? All right, so then in the next little bit of time, Achilles, and we don't know how fast this is either because, again, we don't know what exactly Achilles' speed is, but Achilles gets to that point. But in the meantime, because they're both at least moving somewhat, the tortoise has gotten to some point here. All right, then we keep repeating this process. But every time Achilles moves to where the tortoise has been, and he can do that as fast as you please, the tortoise, because the tortoise is at least moving at some finite speed, will back a little bit further. And while the distances between them will become smaller and smaller and smaller, Zeno argued, Achilles can never catch the tortoise. Now, we just watch these races. You say, well, let's just set it up, put Achilles and the tortoise side by side and watch. And zoom, Achilles goes on past. Zeno knows that. But he has two options. He can either say, that's an illusion.
State of art of hustle.
Because reason shows us that Achilles can't catch the tortoise, so that must be an illusion. Or else, we've got some peculiar ideas about motion. Because the question would be, what's wrong with this analysis? I mean, you could analyze it another way. You could say, all right, let's say in the time it takes the tortoise to move 1 foot, Achilles will move so many more feet. And in that way, you could analyze this problem. So plainly, Achilles can not only catch, but overtake, pass, and just stomp the tortoise as far as this race is concerned. But that's not the, Zeno says, what's wrong with this analysis? This analysis seems to make no mistakes. It's not just that you can give me another, it's not good enough for you just to give me another analysis which can show that Achilles can pass the tortoise, unless there's an error in this analysis. This analysis shows that it's impossible. So at the very least, what Zeno's paradox is, and there's a whole bunch of them, at the very least, what Zeno's paradox did was to show that there's complexities in the idea of motion, and the idea of change, perhaps, but especially the idea of motion, that at that time, and perhaps even to the present day, have not been fully analyzed, have not been fully appreciated. People still argue about these paradoxes, by the way. I mean, no one thinks that...
I didn't know Sprunk was even available.
It's possible, but these paradoxes continue to be very interesting intellectual objects, because you still want to know what's wrong with it. Something's wrong with it, but what's wrong with it? All right, so here we have all these different people arguing all these different things. Thales saying water is the most basic element in the world. Anaximenes, I think he was, I didn't mention him, but he's the one who said that air is the most basic thing in the world. Other people said, other stuff was more basic. I mentioned Anaximander, he says, no, none of them is most basic. Heraclitus says everything's changed, there is no permanence. Parmenides saying everything's permanent, there is no change. Each and every one of these people had powerful arguments that seem to support their position. And this is in the area that we might think of as among the most secure in our present era, in the area of the study of the physical sciences. So along comes Protagoras. I'll get to you in a second, but along comes... I'll put him on a new sheet. No, I will. I just increase the size of this screen. Along comes a guy named Protagoras, and others who are sometimes called sophists, with the claim that it's all relative. There isn't any single right answer to these questions, like, what's the world made of? It says, man, quote, is the measure of all things. Of what's right and what's wrong, of what's true and what's false. There are no correct, objective answers to any questions. It all depends on your point of view. For many of the sophists in particular, it all depends on your culture. Now, we're used to thinking that there's a fairly widespread belief that that's true about ethics. I mean, lots of people believe that. A lot of people don't believe it. But a lot of people in the present era believe the questions about what's right and what's wrong are basically social and cultural questions. There are no ultimately correct answers concerning what's ethically right and what's ethically wrong. All you got is different cultures have different attitudes towards this. Now, if you take that basic approach, that's relativism, that's ethical. If you take that basic approach and you expand that to include everything, then you have Protagoras' theory. Okay, back to you. Tortoise and the hare.
You can let the gap between the two be reduced. So, we're using the right answer.
Well, is it not true? I'll try and do this. I'm not altogether sure that I'm competent to do this as well as anyone close to Zeno would say. I can guess and say, is it not true? We just rehearse the same thing over. Is it not true that as Achilles runs from any one of these arbitrary places on the line to the next place where the tortoise is it not true that the tortoise really moved some finite distance beyond, during that time, no matter how slow you imagine that, if motion is continuous, no matter how slow you imagine the motion of the tortoise, isn't it true, he would ask, that by the time Achilles gets to this old position of the tortoise will be. And isn't that, can't you,